Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that the world is now 10 degrees Celsius hotter than it was yesterday, and that this new temperature isn't going away. That's not just a bad heat wave or a freak summer. This would be a total transformation of Earth's climate permanently, and it wouldn't take long for everything around us to start changing in ways most of us can't even imagine. A jump of 10 degrees globally might not sound huge at first, but this kind of rise would make many places on Earth completely unlivable almost immediately. The hottest parts of the world, like the Middle East, parts of Africa, and South Asia, would become so hot that just going outside for more than a few minutes could be deadly. Cities that already deal with extreme heat, like Kuwait City or Delhi, would face heat levels beyond what the human body can survive for long. It's not just about personal comfort either. It's about how this level of heat would break the systems we rely on. Roads and train tracks would warp. Power grids would struggle to keep up with the demand for air conditioning. In many places, blackouts would become common as everyone tried to escape the heat, putting more pressure on aging infrastructure. Planes might not be able to take off in the hottest areas because high temperatures make the air thinner and reduce lift. Now think about the Arctic and Antarctic. These frozen regions would melt at an unprecedented speed. Greenland's entire ice sheet, which holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by over 6 meters, would melt into the oceans. The same goes for parts of Antarctica, and when that happens, coastlines across the world would start disappearing. Cities like Miami, Jakarta, and Venice could be underwater or turned into swamps full of salt water. But sea level rise is just part of it. The ocean itself would change. Coral reefs would die almost everywhere. They've already been suffering under smaller temperature rises, but with 10 degrees added, the oceans would be way too warm for coral to survive. These reefs are home to a massive portion of marine life, so losing them would send shock waves through the food chain, from tiny fish all the way to sharks and whales, and we'd lose more than just sea life. On land, massive forests like the Amazon rainforest would start to dry out and catch fire. The Amazon helps cool the earth and produces a lot of the oxygen we breathe, but with temperatures staying this high forever, it would shift from being a tropical rainforest to a dry savanna, or even a desert in some places. That kind of transformation would release billions of tons of carbon back into the air, making the climate problem even worse. These aren't slow, distant effects either. Some of these changes would begin within the first few years, others would unfold over decades, but once they start, they'd be very hard, maybe even impossible to stop. In the next part, we'll look at how these rising temperatures would lead to non-stop disasters like mega droughts, unstoppable wildfires, and more destructive hurricanes. Events that would become part of everyday life. With a permanent global rise of 10 degrees Celsius, the weather would no longer feel random or seasonal. It would feel like chaos. Dangerous storms, once rare, would start happening all the time. Heat doesn't just make days uncomfortable, it powers the atmosphere, turning normal weather into something violent and destructive. Hurricanes, for example, feed off warm ocean water. With oceans much hotter than ever before, hurricanes would become bigger, stronger, and more frequent. We're not just talking about Category 4 or 5 storms. We'd start seeing storms that go beyond the current scale, tearing apart coastlines and flooding entire regions. Places that rarely dealt with hurricanes before, like parts of Europe or South America, might start facing regular landfalls. At the same time, long-lasting droughts would begin to spread across continents. Regions that already depend on seasonal rain, like Central Africa, Southern Asia, and the American Southwest, would begin drying out completely. Rivers like the Nile, the Indus, and the Colorado could shrink so much that they'd no longer reach the sea. That would be devastating for the hundreds of millions of people who rely on those rivers for farming, drinking water, and basic survival. Without rain and with intense heat baking the land, wildfires would explode in size and frequency. Forests wouldn't just burn once a year, they could burn several times in a decade. Even rainforests, which normally stay damp, would become dry enough to catch fire. These fires wouldn't just destroy trees, they'd wipe out entire ecosystems, fill the air with smoke, and send harmful gases into the sky, which would make the air even hotter and more dangerous to breathe. With extreme droughts and constant fires, food production would begin to crash. Crops like wheat, rice, and corn don't grow well in extreme heat, and farms would struggle to get enough water. Farming regions like the American Midwest, India's plains, and China's rice belt would face serious losses. Even countries that currently export food would find it hard to feed their own people. This would lead to food shortages, price spikes, and fights over limited resources. but it's not just food that would be in trouble. Water itself would become harder and harder to find. Lakes and reservoirs would dry up. Glaciers that normally feed rivers, like those in the Himalayas and the Andes, would melt away and stop providing water during dry seasons. Desalination, the process of turning seawater into fresh water, is an option, but it uses a lot of energy. And many of the regions that need it most wouldn't have the infrastructure or money to scale it up fast enough. The heat would also cause strange, unpredictable changes in rainfall patterns. Some places would go years without proper rain, while others would get hit with sudden massive downpours that cause flash floods. Cities with poor drainage systems like Lagos or Manila could see streets turn into rivers overnight. These extreme shifts from dry to wet and back again would wreck buildings, ruin crops, and make planning for the future nearly impossible. This constant cycle of destruction, storms, fires, droughts, and floods, would put enormous pressure on countries to respond. Emergency services would be overwhelmed, insurance companies might stop covering disasters altogether, and people living in areas hit over and over would start moving, setting off the largest climate migrations in human history. In the next part, we'll look at what happens when huge parts of the Earth become uninhabitable and how that could change the global map forever. If the planet warmed by 10 degrees Celsius and stayed that way, it wouldn't just make life uncomfortable, it would make entire regions completely unlivable. The hottest parts of the world, like the Middle East, Northern Africa, and parts of South Asia, would experience daily temperatures well above 50 degrees Celsius. That kind of heat is not just dangerous, it's deadly, especially in places without widespread access to air conditioning or reliable infrastructure. At those temperatures, the human body struggles to cool itself. In humid areas where sweat can't evaporate quickly, even healthy people sitting in the shade could suffer heat stroke within hours. Hospitals would fill up with cases of dehydration and heat-related illnesses, but many health systems wouldn't be able to keep up. Power outages, already common during heat waves, would become even more dangerous, as people lost access to cooling systems when they needed them most. And it wouldn't stop at just making people sick. Entire cities would become too hot for humans to live in. Places like Phoenix, Baghdad, and New Delhi might need to be abandoned during the hottest months. Airports would struggle to function, roads would soften and crack, and buildings would warp from the constant heat. In many places, basic infrastructure like electricity, water systems, and transportation would fail under the strain. Millions, possibly billions of people would be forced to move. This would lead to one of the largest and fastest migrations in human history. People would flee to cooler regions like Northern Europe, Canada, and parts of Russia, but those places wouldn't be prepared for a sudden population surge. Housing, healthcare, and job markets would be pushed beyond their limits, leading to overcrowded cities, rising tensions, and possible conflict over resources. Meanwhile, countries that couldn't absorb the migrants would start closing their borders, leading to political instability. Nations might fight over fresh water supplies, farmland, and access to cooler zones. Internal displacement would also become a huge issue, with people moving from one part of a country to another, causing local economies to collapse and governments to struggle with maintaining order. At the same time, the natural world would continue to suffer. Ecosystems that once helped cool the planet would begin to collapse. Forests in the Amazon and Congo regions would dry out and turn into savannas. Wetlands would disappear. Even polar regions, once frozen year-round, would become warmer and more unstable, releasing even more greenhouse gases from melting permafrost. The combined impact on biodiversity would be devastating. Animals and plants that cannot migrate or adapt quickly enough would vanish. Pollinators like bees would decline, affecting food production even further. Coral reefs, already struggling with ocean warming and acidification, would vanish completely, wiping out entire marine ecosystems. It's important to realize that these changes wouldn't be spaced out over centuries. They could happen within just a few decades. In the next part, we'll explore how governments, science, and technology might try to respond to such a massive crisis, and whether there's any way to turn things around in a world that has already passed the point of no return. In a world that's permanently 10 degrees Celsius hotter, the question becomes, what, if anything, can humanity do to survive? At this point, it's no longer about stopping climate change. It's about adapting fast enough to stay alive. That means completely transforming how we live, build, grow food, and even govern. One of the biggest challenges would be keeping people fed. Traditional farming methods would collapse in many regions. Crops like wheat, corn, and rice wouldn't survive the heat, especially in places that already struggle with drought. Farmers would have to shift to heat-tolerant varieties or even move agriculture indoors using vertical farms and hydroponics. This kind of farming needs energy, water, and high-tech systems, which not every country would be able to afford or manage. Water would be just as critical. With rivers drying up and glaciers gone, new sources of fresh water would be needed. Desalination plants could become more common, especially in coastal areas, but they require huge amounts of energy. Recycling wastewater might also become standard in many cities, and rainwater collection could be essential in areas where rainfall still happens. Energy use would skyrocket, as people rely on cooling systems to survive, but at the same time, fossil fuel use would need to be phased out completely. That means a massive global shift to solar, wind, geothermal, and nuclear energy, all while trying to build power grids that can handle unpredictable demand and extreme conditions. Batteries and energy storage would have to be upgraded to store power during blackouts or storms. Architecture and city planning would also need to change. Cities would be rebuilt with reflective materials, more shaded areas, and greenery to reduce urban heat. Entire neighborhoods might move underground or be built with climate control in mind. Roads, railways, and bridges would need to be made with materials that can withstand extreme heat without warping or melting. At the global level, governments would be under constant pressure to maintain stability. Climate refugees would still be on the move, and international cooperation would be more important than ever. Alliances would form not just around politics, but around climate survival. Wealthy nations might be expected to help fund adaptation in poorer countries to prevent total collapse. This could lead to new global agreements or massive tensions if countries refuse to help one another. Technology would play a major role too. Geoengineering, once considered too risky, could become a last resort. Ideas like spraying aerosols into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight or creating artificial clouds might be tested, but these are unpredictable solutions, and many scientists warn they could have unintended side effects, possibly even making some regions drier or colder than before. Mental health would be a growing concern. Living in a world constantly on the edge, facing resource shortages, deadly heat, and climate disasters would take a toll. Communities would need strong support systems, and education would have to include not just science and survival skills, but also emotional resilience. In the end, surviving a 10-degree Celsius temperature rise would require the biggest transformation in human history. It would mean rethinking everything from the ground up. While it's hard to imagine such a world, scientists say we still have a small window to prevent it, but that window is closing fast. What happens next depends on what humanity chooses to do right now.